Somewhere at the top of the world, past every people the Greeks had ever met, there was supposedly a place where nobody got sick, nobody grew old, and the sun barely set. The Greeks called it Hyperborea, and for 5 centuries their greatest poets, historians, and geographers couldn't stop arguing about it. What makes this legend so strange isn't the paradise itself, since every ancient culture had one or two of those. It's that the Greeks kept trying to map it, and they treated Hyperborea not as myth, but as a geographical problem, a real location they just hadn't reached yet. In trying to pin it down, they revealed far more about themselves than they ever did about the frozen north. The word Hyperborea translates fairly directly. Boreas was the Greek god of the north wind, and hyper means beyond. So Hyperborea was simply the land beyond the north wind, a place so far north that even Boreas couldn't reach it. The logic had an odd elegance to it. Because the cold northern winds couldn't penetrate Hyperborea, the land enjoyed a perpetual mild climate. The earliest references to this far northern place are frustratingly vague. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, claimed that both Hesiod and Homer had mentioned the Hyperboreans. He noted that Homer's supposed reference came from a lost poem called the Epigony, and Herodotus himself wasn't convinced Homer had actually written it. By the time anyone was writing detailed accounts of Hyperborea, the concept already felt ancient. It seemed to have always been there, floating at the edges of Greek geographical knowledge, never quite coming into focus. The first person who reportedly tried to bring it into focus was Aristeas of Proconnesus, a perhaps legendary traveler who was active around the 7th century BC. Aristeas composed an epic called the Arimaspeia, which described his claimed journey into the far north. According to his account, he'd traveled to the land of the Isidones, a people living somewhere in Central Asia, and they'd told him about the lands beyond their own borders. The geography he laid out was essentially a layered map of the north. First there was Isidones, then the one-eyed Arimaspians who fought gold-guarding griffins, then finally the Hyperboreans and the great ocean at the edge of the world. The Arimaspeia didn't survive intact, but its fragments were widely cited, and it served as the primary Greek source on the peoples of the far north. The poem also made a claim central to the Hyperborea legend, that Apollo spent his winters among the Hyperboreans. The god of light, music, and prophecy lived with them for part of every year when his summer abode became too cold. The most vivid surviving description of Hyperborea from the ancient world comes from the poet Pindar, who wrote his 10th Pythian ode around 498 BC. In it, he told the story of Perseus traveling to the land of the Hyperboreans, and what he described there was unlike anything else in Greek literature. Pindar described a semi-immortal people who lived entirely without work, disease, or fear of divine punishment. Their days were filled with feasting, music, and the worship of Apollo, who brought them gifts from the gods every year. When Perseus arrived, he found that the entire society was completely dedicated to this patron deity. Notably, while the Hyperboreans recognized this powerful and influential Greek god, aside from rituals to Apollo, nothing about them seemed Greek at all. They weren't an outpost of Greek culture at the top of the world, but instead, something entirely different. Pindar also made a point that would echo through later accounts. You couldn't actually get to Hyperborea. Neither by ship nor on foot, he wrote, could anyone find the road to their gathering place. It was beyond the reach of ordinary mortals, and only a figure like Perseus, the semi-divine hero and a son of Zeus, could cross that boundary. This idea that Hyperborea existed in a space that was geographically real but physically inaccessible was a tension the Greeks never fully resolved. About 50 years after Pindar, Herodotus took up the question of Hyperborea in Book 4 of his Histories, and his treatment was markedly different. Herodotus was uncharacteristically skeptical about the claims of this northern land, at least to an extent. He said he couldn't find anyone who claimed first-hand knowledge of the lands beyond the far north, and he noted that even Aristeas hadn't claimed to have visited the location. Aristeas had only gone as far as the Isidones and was reporting what they'd told him about the peoples further on. But Herodotus didn't dismiss the Hyperboreans entirely, because he had something more interesting than travelers' tales to work with. He had physical evidence, or at least a ritual chain of custody, that implied physical evidence. He described in detail a practice by which sacred offerings from the Hyperboreans were transported to the island of Delos, Apollo's sacred birthplace. According to Herodotus, these offerings were wrapped in wheat straw and passed from people to people in a relay across the ancient world. They'd travel from the Hyperboreans to the Scythians, then westward from nation to nation until they reached the Adriatic, where they were then sent to the Temple of Apollo. This wasn't something Herodotus was speculating about, and he claimed he was describing an active ritual practice that the Delians themselves told him about. Herodotus recorded that originally, the Hyperboreans had sent 2 young women to deliver the gifts in person, accompanied by 5 male guards. The delegation, however, didn't return, and after that, the Hyperboreans changed their approach and adopted the relay system. They passed the offerings to their neighbors, trusting each successive people to forward them along. For all his skepticism, Herodotus acknowledged that the story of the offerings was widely believed and well attested. He accepted the possibility that it could be a real place, but overall he seems to have believed the offerings originally came from somewhere in Central Asia. Hecataeus of Abdera, a Greek historian working around 300 BC, compiled all the existing stories about the Hyperboreans into a lengthy treatise. That treatise is now lost, but substantial portions of it were preserved by Diodorus Siculus, who was writing his Universal History in the 1st century BC. The version Diodorus recorded, drawing on Hecataeus, placed Hyperborea on a large fertile island in the ocean beyond the land of the Celts. The island reportedly enjoyed a climate so mild that it produced 2 harvests every year. He confirmed that its inhabitants worshipped Apollo above all other gods, and the entire island was essentially a sacred precinct dedicated to him. Diodorus described the Hyperboreans as a nation of musicians who sang hymns to Apollo continuously and played the lyre with great skill. According to Diodorus, Hecataeus described a great circular temple on the island, dedicated to, you guessed it, Apollo. The temple was circular or spherical in shape and enormous in scale, likely much larger than anything in the known world. Hecataeus also introduced an odd astronomical detail that fascinated ancient scientists and historians alike. He claimed that from this island, the moon appeared to hang remarkably close to the Earth, and that observable features on its surface could be seen. He also claimed that Apollo only visited the island every 19 years, but he squared this with the previous legend. This is a period that corresponds to the Metonic cycle, the roughly 19-year period, after which the phases of the moon recur on the same days of the solar year. This again fascinated the ancients, and some modern scholars have speculated that the ancient Greeks believed this was why the Hyperboreans didn't appear to age. In this telling, they were essentially aging on a 19-year scale, meaning a Hyperborean lifespan would be counted in the thousands of years. Across every version of the Hyperborea tradition, from Aristeas through Pindar through Herodotus through Hecataeus, one element remains absolutely constant. Hyperborea was Apollo's paradise on Earth, and the residents worshipped him with a fervor matched by no other people. The Greeks were saying that one of their most important gods had a second home among a distant, blessed people. They also claimed that those people sent tribute to the Greek world, acknowledging the shared bond. Hyperborea served as proof that Apollo's reach extended to the very edges of the known world and beyond. It was, in essence, a theological and geographic claim about the nature and power of the Hellenic gods. But the tradition also reflected something about how the Greeks understood the limits of their own civilization. Hyperborea was everything Greece aspired to be but couldn't quite manage. A society without war, without disease, without the corruptions of age and politics. It was the ideal push to the farthest point on the map, always one horizon beyond reach, a place to which the Greeks had a small physical connection, but could never visit. Perhaps Hyperborea endured in the Greek imagination precisely because it couldn't be verified. Every generation could project its own longings onto that blank space beyond the north wind, and no traveler would ever come back to say they'd got it wrong. The offerings kept arriving on Delos, wrapped in straw, passed hand to hand across an entire continent. Nobody could say for certain where they'd started, and it was a mystery the ancient world was surprisingly content to leave unsolved. Now, no segment on this northern island would be complete without mentioning perhaps the most famous theory on where it actually was. This enduring modern theory places Hyperborea in the British Isles, based largely on later classical descriptions. In particular, Diodorus Siculus described a large northern island beyond the Celts, with a mild climate, fertile land, and a circular temple to Apollo. Some modern interpreters connect this to Britain, especially sites like Stonehenge, whose circular form loosely echoes the temple mentioned in ancient accounts. The Isles also fit geographically with a distant northwestern land, known but not fully explored by Greeks. However, this identification is very much speculative, and earlier writers like Herodotus placed Hyperborea far beyond known peoples, often toward Central Asia. The offerings to Delos also appear to have come from Central Asia as well, not in the direction of the British Isles. Sometime around 1392, one of the most powerful men in the world became convinced that his body was made of glass. Charles VI of France, a king who commanded armies and ruled over millions, reportedly had iron rods sewn into his clothing and refused to let people near him. He was genuinely terrified that the slightest contact would shatter him into pieces. It was just one feature of a mental deterioration that stretched across 3 decades, leaving France effectively leaderless during one of the most turbulent periods in its history. And Charles wasn't even the only case. He was just the most powerful person to suffer from what physicians of the time recognized as a genuine medical condition. They called it the glass delusion, and at its peak, it spread across the elite of the continent with a persistence that bordered on epidemic. The dominant medical framework, inherited from the Greek physician Galen and from Hippocrates before him, held that the body was governed by 4 humors. Health meant keeping them balanced, and when they fell out of balance, illness followed. And the nature of the illness depended on which humor had gone wrong. An excess of black bile produced a condition called melancholia, but this wasn't just sadness in the way we'd think of it. Melancholia was a broad category of mental disturbance that could look like almost anything. Some melancholics became convinced they were animals, while others believed they were cursed. Some also came to believe, with total conviction, that their bodies had transformed into glass, despite all physical evidence to the contrary. Despite this, though, the reasoning within the humoral system wasn't actually unreasonable. Black bile was classified as cold and dry, and physicians theorized that in the heat of the body, an excess of black bile took on what they described as a glassy quality. If the bile itself had become glass-like, the thinking went, it wasn't so strange that the sufferer's mind would interpret the body as having become glass too. The cold, dry properties of the humor produced a brittleness that the imagination then made literal. In a medical culture where the boundary between the physical and the psychological was non-existent, this made a kind of internal sense. The glass delusion wasn't treated as folklore or superstition by the physicians who encountered it, perhaps because of who it was affecting. It attracted serious clinical attention from some of the most prominent medical minds of the period. André du Laurent, personal physician to Henry IV of France in the late 16th century, described multiple cases in his treatise on diseases of melancholy. One of his patients, a nobleman, had become convinced that his body was shaped like a glass pitcher. The man reportedly slept buried in straw, terrified that he might tip over in the night and pour himself out across the floor. Another of his patients believed specifically that his feet were made of glass and refused to walk, afraid that each step would crack and destroy them. Alfonso de Santa Cruz, a physician at the Spanish royal court, documented remarkably similar cases in his own medical writings. He independently described the same pitcher delusion, which suggests either that the two were aware of the same patient or that the delusion manifested yet again. Notably, the symptoms for the delusion were remarkably uniform. Patients refused to sit on hard surfaces, begged visitors to keep their distance, and lived in constant paralyzing fear. They generally wrapped themselves in heavy blankets, but not just to prevent shattering, as you may think. They were also extremely concerned that observers could view their interiors, since they genuinely believed that they were see-through. The Italian scholar Tommaso Garzoni, writing in the 1580s, cataloged the glass delusion in his encyclopedic survey of human conditions. He treated it as one of many possible expressions of disordered reason, notable for how specific it was, but not fundamentally different from a man who believed he was a wolf. For Garzoni, these were all branches of the same disease tree, all rooted in humoral imbalance, and all worthy of medical, not spiritual, intervention. The question of why glass in particular became such a focus of the delusion is something that we modern people ask without understanding the medieval significance of glass. Glass held a position in the late medieval imagination that no other material occupied. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Venetian glassmakers had perfected techniques for producing glass of extraordinary clarity and thinness. Glass objects were filtering into aristocratic households across Europe, prized for their beauty, but defined by their fragility. For a culture that associated glass with refinement and breakability, the leap to imagining one's own body as glass wasn't as absurd as it sounds. Several physicians of the period noted that the glass delusion seemed to afflict the educated and the wealthy far more often than common people. Some have speculated that this is because peasants were, in essence, not familiar with fine glass in a day-to-day setting. They couldn't touch it or interact with it in the way a nobleman or a noblewoman could, and they may not know its properties. Notably, Miguel de Cervantes captured the condition in his 1613 novella about a young law student who becomes convinced he's made of glass after being poisoned. The character insists that because he's glass, his perceptions are clearer than those of ordinary men of flesh. It was fiction, of course, but Cervantes was drawing from a medical reality his readers would have recognized immediately. The glass delusion wasn't obscure by the early 17th century, since it was common enough to serve as the premise of a story without requiring explanation. Medieval and early modern physicians didn't simply document the glass delusion and move on. They attempted to treat it, and their methods, while grounded in humoral theory, reflected a surprisingly patient and humane approach. Some accounts describe physicians deliberately dropping glass objects near their patients so the sufferer could watch glass shatter while their own body remained intact. This is remarkably similar to modern exposure therapy, wherein there is a gradual confrontation of the fear. Others prescribe dietary changes aimed at rebalancing the humors, reducing cold and dry foods in favor of warm and moist ones to counteract the excess black bile. Music, gentle conversation, and carefully managed exercise were also recommended as ways to draw the melancholic mind away from its fixation. The medical literature was candid about the difficulty of treating the glass delusion, but the treatments reveal something important about how the condition was understood. Physicians didn't assign blame. Instead, they treated it as illness, rooted in the body's constitution, and approached it with patience and whatever medical knowledge they had. The sufferers were treated as being sick people, not bad people, or people who deserved ridicule for their delusional belief. Ultimately, the glass delusion faded from medical literature by the late 17th century. For reasons that remain unknown, despite hundreds of years of precedent, people virtually stopped believing that their bodies were made of glass around this time. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy coming in with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget that you can join up on the YouTube membership or the Patreon to take your support for my content to the next level. Now, with that said, let's get back to the historical mysteries, since we've still got a lot of ground to cover. For over 1,000 years, no army on earth managed to breach the walls of Constantinople. Not the Persians, not the Arabs, not the Bulgars, and not the Viking raiders that plagued the city. Empires rose and crumbled, plagues swept continents, entire civilizations blinked out of existence, and still those walls held. By the spring of 1453, they'd been standing for more than a millennium. The walls were a double ring of limestone and brick stretching 4 miles across the only land approach to the city, fronted by a 60-foot moat. Armies had thrown themselves at those walls for centuries and walked away, beaten. So when a 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan decided he was going to be the one to finally take Constantinople, most of the known world had good reason to think he was out of his mind. At its height under Justinian in the 6th century, Constantinople was the largest and wealthiest city in the Christian world, home to perhaps 500,000 people. It was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call Byzantium, and it sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It controlled the narrow strait of the Bosphorus and the shipping lanes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and for centuries, it was the richest prize in the world. But by the 15th century, the empire had been slowly bleeding out for centuries. The catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204, when fellow Christians sacked the city and carved up Byzantine territory, dealt a wound from which Byzantium never fully recovered. By the time Constantine XI Palaiologos took the throne in 1449, the so-called empire consisted of Constantinople itself, a few scraps of the Peloponnese, and not much else. The city's population had collapsed to somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people. Entire neighborhoods lay abandoned, with farms and orchards growing inside the walls where houses once stood. Constantine knew what was coming, since the Ottoman Turks had already swallowed almost everything around him. His appeals to Western Europe for military aid produced sympathy, promises, and almost nothing of practical value. Pope Nicholas V tried to rally support, but Western Europe was fractured by its own conflicts and internal politics. The old wound of the Great Schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches didn't help. Many ordinary Byzantines were deeply hostile to any deal with Rome or with Western Europeans in general. The Genoese and the Venetians had offered to help over the previous centuries, but simply ended up behaving more like vultures, tearing strips off the rotting imperial carcass. However, as you'll see, the Genoese did valiantly take part in the last stand against the Ottomans, attempting to come through in the 11th hour. Mehmed II became sultan for the second time in 1451 at the age of 19, and let's just say he was ambitious. His father Murad II had briefly abdicated in Mehmed's favor once before, only to take the throne back when the boy proved unable to manage the empire's politics. That humiliation burned in him, and when Murad passed away and Mehmed reclaimed the sultanate, he was determined to prove himself. He spent the better part of 2 years preparing for what would come next. In 1452, he built the fortress of Rumeli Hisari on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. This effectively choked off the strait and cut Constantinople's access to the Black Sea, and it sent an unmistakable message. He also commissioned what was reportedly the largest cannon ever built at that time. A Hungarian engineer named Orban had first offered his services to Constantine XI, who couldn't afford him. Mehmed could, and the resulting weapon, sometimes called the Great Bombard, was roughly 27 feet long. It was capable of hurling stone balls weighing around 600 pounds over a mile. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move, and it could reportedly only manage a handful of shots per day because it needed hours to cool between firings. But when it hit the ancient Theodosian walls, which weren't designed with giant artillery pieces in mind, the effect was devastating. The siege began on April 6, 1453, and Mehmed arrived with an army that contemporary sources estimated at anywhere from 60,000 to over 100,000 troops. Against this, Constantine XI had somewhere around 7,000 defenders, including roughly 700 Genoese soldiers under a skilled commander named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. The arithmetic was horrifying, but the defenders had significant advantages, even beyond the usual siege advantage. The Theodosian walls were still the most formidable fortifications ever built, even after 1,000 years, and even after the invention of modern artillery. The city was surrounded by water on 3 sides, with a massive chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn to block enemy ships. The defenders, for their part, also fought with the desperate energy of people who knew there was nowhere to retreat. For weeks, Mehmed hammered the walls with his cannons. The Great Bombard and dozens of smaller guns pounded the fortifications day after day, opening breaches that the defenders would frantically repair overnight. Ottoman assault waves crashed against the walls repeatedly and were thrown back every time. Giustiniani proved to be a superb tactical commander, racing along the walls to reinforce wherever the fighting was thickest. The Ottomans also tried tunneling under the walls, but a Scottish engineer in Byzantine service named John Grant detected the mines and flooded or collapsed most of them. On April 20th, 4 ships, 3 Genoese vessels, and 1 Byzantine transport loaded with grain fought their way past the Ottoman fleet and into the harbor. It was a small victory, and it gave the defenders hope that more help from the west might follow. Then Mehmed did something that still seems barely believable. The chain across the Golden Horn was preventing his fleet from entering the harbor and attacking the city's weaker sea walls. Most commanders would have tried to break or circumvent the chain directly. Mehmed instead ordered roughly 70 ships hauled overland on greased wooden tracks up and over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata. They then went down into the Golden Horn on the other side of the chain. It's the kind of maneuver that sounds like something from a myth, but multiple independent sources from both sides confirm it happened. It worked, and the defenders, already stretched impossibly thin, now had to garrison the harbor walls as well. By late May, both sides were exhausted, and Mehmed's own council reportedly included advisors who urged him to negotiate or withdraw. They argued that a prolonged siege was draining resources and that a relief fleet from Venice might arrive at any time. Mehmed overruled them, and he ordered a final assault for the morning of May 29th, 1453, and that would be the last day in history where Roman citizens would wake up to a Roman dawn. The attack came in waves, beginning in the early hours before dawn. Mehmed sent his least experienced troops first, irregulars and conscripts whose job was essentially to tire out the defenders before the elite units arrived. For hours, the defenders fought them off, but then came the Anatolian regulars, and the fighting grew fiercer. The walls were breached in several places, but the defenders kept sealing the gaps. Two things then happened in quick succession that decided the fate of the city. First, Giovanni Giustiniani took a serious wound, either from a crossbow bolt or a small cannonball that pierced his breastplate. He asked to be carried to a ship, and while Constantine reportedly begged him to stay, Giustiniani was evacuated through one of the city gates. When the Genoese defenders saw their commander being carried away, many of them broke and followed him toward the harbor. With the Genoese leaving, panic spread along the wall almost instantly. Around the same time, a small group of Ottoman soldiers discovered that a minor gate in the walls, known as the Kirka Porta, had been left unlocked or incompletely sealed. Some have even suggested that the gate was intentionally left unlocked by someone inside the city, though ultimately there's no proof that this ever happened. They pushed through and raised the Ottoman banner on the inner wall, and the sight of enemy flags behind the defenses spread panic through the remaining defenders. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, reportedly threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting. He was never seen again, and the Byzantine historian George Safrances, who had been a close friend, later wrote that the emperor's body was never positively identified. Legend says that he perished fighting alongside his men in a heroic last stand, and honestly, it appears to be true. Mehmed entered the city later that day. He was 21 years old, and he'd just accomplished what generations of predecessors could not. By long-standing custom, his troops were permitted to loot for 3 days, and they did so thoroughly. Several later historians claim that Mehmed walked through the ruined imperial palace and was moved by its emptiness. He reportedly murmured verses from a Persian poem about the impermanence of worldly glory. Whether that anecdote is true or embellished by later chroniclers, it's persisted for a reason. The fall of Constantinople closed the last chapter on the Eastern Roman Empire, a political entity that traced its unbroken lineage back to Romulus and the Roman kingdom. Going by the traditional founding of the Roman kingdom, this was a period of exactly 2,205 years between the founding and the fall of the last direct vestige of the Roman Empire. Now, I know someone in the comments will mention the Empire of Trebizond or any number of other candidates, but the fall of Constantinople marked the end of an era. Scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts and knowledge that would help fuel the Italian Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire, for its part, gained a capital it would hold for nearly 500 more years, and the Greco-Roman nature of the city would gradually change over time. Trade routes shifted, and within decades, European powers were investing heavily in finding sea routes to Asia that didn't pass through Ottoman territory. That search would eventually lead to the voyages of Columbus and da Gama, reshaping the world in ways that no one standing on those broken walls in the spring of 1453 could imagine. Interestingly, Constantinople didn't fall because its defenders were cowards. In fact, as I've explained, it was quite the opposite. They held for 53 days against impossible odds, outnumbered by as much as 10 to 1, and many of them perished on the walls rather than surrender. The last Roman emperor himself almost certainly joined the fray, heroically perishing alongside his soldiers. Constantine, in essence, went out in a way that would have filled Livy with unbridled Roman pride, and personally, I find that both poetic and bittersweet. In the end, Constantinople fell because the empire had been running on fumes for centuries, and still, despite that, the Romans gave one of the most heroic last stands in history. Imagine waking up to the revelation that you're not in the 21st century, but actually in 1729. More bizarre still is that this doesn't require any sci-fi plot or fantasy elements. 3 whole centuries of history were supposedly made up and never occurred. This wild scenario is exactly what the phantom time hypothesis proposes. It's a conspiracy theory suggesting that nearly 300 years of the early Middle Ages were inserted into the calendar by ambitious rulers and filled with fake history. The phantom time hypothesis is a pseudo-historical theory first put forward in the 1990s by a German historian named Herbert Illig. According to Illig, the period between 614 and 911 never truly happened, but rather they were fabricated. In Illig's version of history, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II conspired to rewrite the calendar. They supposedly wanted to place themselves at the prestigious year AD 1000, believing it to be a millennial milestone with great Christian significance. To achieve this, the theory claims, these leaders added 297 years to history, adjusting dates and events so that their own reigns would include the magic year 1000. In this bizarre alternate timeline, entire chapters of medieval history were allegedly invented out of whole cloth. For example, Charlemagne, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, would never have existed, and the state he supposedly founded would be nothing more than an invention. Likewise, the Viking raids on England and even entire dynasties such as China's Tang dynasty would be misdated or completely made up. In short, Illig argued that nearly 3 centuries worth of events across Europe and beyond were forged after the fact, creating a phantom period of history. Illig and his supporters pointed to a few historical oddities which they believed hinted that something was wrong with the accepted timeline. One major point was the scarcity of documentary and archaeological evidence in Western Europe for the 7th to 9th centuries. He pointed out that relatively few chronicles or original records survive from that period, a fact he found highly suspicious. To him, this void in the historical record suggested that the era might have been concocted later to fill a gap. Illig also claimed that some buildings dated to the 10th century had surprisingly Roman-like design elements that seemed out of place for the era. He took this as another sign that the timeline of the Roman Empire and its aftermath had been distorted. According to him, medieval builders were closer in time to ancient Rome than conventional history admits. The most famous evidence Illig cited was a calendar quirk. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII's reform of the Julian calendar dropped 10 days to realign with the seasons. Illig argued that if the Julian calendar had truly been running since 45 BC, it should have been off by about 13 days by 1582, not just 10. And funny enough, his math on this was correct, but there was a problem with his reasoning that I'll address in a moment. To him, this hinted that roughly 3 centuries worth of days had never actually passed at all. To achieve this goal, the story imagines that Otto, Sylvester, and their allies ordered monks and scribes to manufacture documents, chronicles, and artifacts for the phantom years. Fake battles, phony royal lineages, and forged charters would have been planted in libraries and archives, tricking future historians. It's an incredibly elaborate notion. A handful of men in the early medieval era supposedly managed to fool the world by inserting a phantom era into our history books. But this, of course, is the major flaw in Illig's theory, the massive scale of the alleged forgery. If the years 614 to 911 AD were invented, it's not only European history that must be falsified, but also the histories of multiple civilizations. During those centuries, the Byzantine Empire and the emerging Caliphate were locked in conflicts, and Tang Dynasty China experienced a golden age of art and science. These were all recorded in detail and these records around the world line up with our current calendar. For phantom time to be real, virtually every scholar and record keeper from Europe to Asia would have to be complicit in the same lie, an almost impossible scenario. Even within Europe alone, the hoax would have to be astonishingly thorough. Think of the countless artifacts, manuscripts, inscriptions, and coins dated to the early Middle Ages. All of them would need to be misdated or forged to fool later historians. Yet archaeologists have unearthed many such items, and their dating fits neatly into the expected timeline. Numerous monastic records, legal documents, and chronicles from Europe's 7th to 10th centuries survive and dovetail with events before and after. Fabricating 3 centuries of such widely attested history without leaving glaring inconsistencies would perhaps be the most audacious undertaking in human history. If hundreds of years were missing, we would also expect to see clues in nature or science, but we don't. Dendrochronology, the dating of wood by tree rings, provides continuous year-by-year timelines stretching well before the 7th century, and it shows no gaps or jumps in sequence. Likewise, historical astronomy serves as a check on chronology. Ancient and medieval observers around the world recorded celestial events that match our timeline. For example, Roman writings note a solar eclipse in 59 AD that astronomers today can pinpoint to that same year. If nearly 3 extra centuries had been inserted into history, those recorded eclipses and appearances of Halley's Comet would be shifted and inconsistent. Finally, the calendar oddity Illig emphasized has a simple explanation. The Gregorian reform of 1582 dropped 10 days not to correct back to Julius Caesar's time, but to realign with the Council of Nicaea in 325. By 1582, about 1,257 years had passed since 325, which corresponds to a 10-day drift, roughly 1 day per 128 years. The Church was resetting the calendar to where it had been in 325, so a 10-day correction was exactly what was needed, with no mysterious missing centuries required. When all is said and done, the phantom time hypothesis is a fascinating thought experiment, but not a serious account of history. Mainstream historians and archaeologists universally reject the idea that the early Middle Ages were an elaborate hoax. There is simply too much evidence that those centuries did occur and were filled with real people, conflicts, and cultural shifts. While it's true that historical records around the 7th to 9th centuries in Europe are relatively sparse, this was due to Europe being at a low point economically. In the final decades of the Byzantine Empire, a philosopher in a small city in southern Greece sat down and wrote a book proposing that the solution to everything was to bring back Zeus. He wanted temples, hymns, daily prayers to the Olympian gods, and a complete restructuring of society along the lines Plato had laid out nearly 2,000 years earlier. His name was Georgios Gemistos, though he'd later rename himself Plethon in a deliberate echo of Plato. And the most remarkable thing about his story isn't that he tried it, it's how close he came to being taken seriously. Plethon was born around 1360, give or take a few years, into a world that was falling apart in slow motion. The Byzantine Empire, which had once controlled everything from southern Spain to the borders of Persia, had been reduced to a handful of territories clinging to the edges of a Turkish tide. Constantinople was still the capital, still technically the seat of a Roman emperor, but the real power had long since shifted to the Turkish sultans, who controlled nearly everything around it. Sometime before 1410, Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos sent Plethon to Mistra, a fortified city in the Peloponnese that served as the capital of the Despotate of Morea. It was one of the last functioning pieces of the empire's once vast territory, a fortified hilltop city overlooking the Laconian plain, and it had become something of a haven for intellectuals. Plethon settled there and spent the rest of his life teaching philosophy, astronomy, history, and geography. He became a legal advisor to the ruling despots and a political counselor with real access to the Byzantine court. And from that position, he spent decades developing what might be the most audacious intellectual project of the late medieval world. Plethon's target was Aristotle, and he went after him hard. For centuries, Aristotle had dominated Greek and Western European thought. The Orthodox Church had essentially baptized Aristotelian philosophy, integrating it into Christian theology so thoroughly that challenging Aristotle felt like heresy. Plethon, perhaps unsurprisingly for someone who tried to revive the old Hellenic gods, thought this was a catastrophic mistake. Around 1438, when he was already in his late 70s, Plethon traveled to Italy as part of the Byzantine delegation to the Council of Florence. The council's official purpose was to reunite the Catholic and Orthodox churches, a desperate diplomatic move to secure economic and military aid. Plethon was there as a lay theologian, but what he actually did in Florence was far more interesting than the formal sessions. He gave lectures on Strabo, the ancient geographer, and he taught classes on Plato to Italian humanists who'd barely encountered Platonic thought in the original Greek. He wrote a treatise comparing Plato and Aristotle, arguing that Plato's conception of God as the active creator of everything was superior to Aristotle's version. He argued that Aristotle had reduced the divine to a mere force rather than an active being. Plethon accused Aristotle of degrading philosophy by wasting time on trivial investigations, when he should have been grappling with the structure of reality and the nature of the divine. Plethon was presenting a living philosophical lineage that the West had almost completely forgotten as the Greek world fell into oblivion over the previous centuries. His student Bessarion, who would later become a cardinal in the Roman Church, never forgot what he learned from Plethon in those years. The Florentine humanist Marsilio Ficino, who would eventually found the Platonic Academy in Florence, later called Plethon the second Plato. But Plethon's real project went far beyond academic philosophy, and back in Mistra he'd been working for years on a secret text that he shared only with his closest disciples. It was called the Nomoi, or Laws, and it laid out a complete alternative civilization that sought to recapture the fire of the ancient Greeks. The Nomoi proposed a new religion based on a reformed version of ancient Greek polytheism, filtered through Neoplatonic philosophy and elements drawn from Zoroastrian cosmology. Zeus sat at the top as the supreme eternal creator, with the other Olympian gods arranged in a strict hierarchy beneath him. The first-order gods who were direct emanations of Zeus, second-order gods below them, and so on down through the ranks. Plethon had systematized the Greek pantheon into something that looked more like a Neoplatonic metaphysical framework with familiar names attached. Taking notes from the Orthodox Christian faith he still officially claimed to be a part of, the religion he designed came with a full liturgical calendar. He prescribed daily prayers, hymns, ritual sacrifices, and seasonal festivals. He treated the ancient gods not as literal beings hurling thunderbolts, but as metaphysical principles that could be approached through contemplation and ritual. In essence, his idea wasn't solely a revival of the Hellenic gods, but of a completely new system where the old Greek gods were modernized. This system turned his imagining of ancient Greek religion into a formal, organized religion that could push back against Christianity and all other religious systems. But religion was only half of this system, and the Nomoi also outlined a political utopia. Plethon proposed a government modeled on Plato's Republic, with a benevolent philosopher king at the top, and a radical program of land redistribution. Of course, there's the usual problem with philosopher kings, and that's the fact that they historically tend to be in severely short supply. But he wasn't too worried about that. Private land ownership would be replaced with communal holdings, and soldiers would be given plots to farm, ensuring both their loyalty and their self-sufficiency. He wanted a standing army trained in ancient Macedonian phalanx tactics and the rebuilding of the Hexamilion Wall across the Isthmus of Corinth to keep the Ottomans out. This latter idea, the rebuilding of the wall, was adopted, at least in part, though these efforts did little to keep the Turks out. While in Italy, Platon's philosophical work was received with something close to reverence, his reputation in the Greek world was much more controversial. Platon had a student named George Scholarios, who'd studied under him but gradually turned against everything he stood for. Scholarios became a fierce defender of Aristotle and of orthodox Christian theology. He wrote a formal defense of Aristotle in response to Platon's writings, and the two of them exchanged increasingly heated written arguments. Importantly, though, for reasons that will soon become apparent, it appears that Scholarios didn't know the full scale of Platon's private beliefs. The real reckoning came after Platon's death. He either died in Mistra around 1452, or possibly just before or just after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. We don't know for certain. It's really hard to emphasize what a chaotic time this was for the Greeks, since their civilization had, in essence, finally completely collapsed. With his passing, his manuscript of the Nomoi, which he'd kept carefully restricted during his lifetime, ended up in the hands of Princess Theodora, the wife of the despot of Morea. She passed it to Scholarios, who by then had become Patriarch Gennadios II of Constantinople, the foremost religious authority in the Greek Orthodox world. Scholarios read it and was horrified. Here was a book by one of the most respected philosophers in the Greek world that openly rejected Christianity. Platon, during his lifetime, hadn't openly proposed replacing Christianity with pagan worship, instead only sharing the idea with his closest insiders. In 1460, Scholarios put the manuscript to the flame and attempted to destroy every copy of it. He called Platon a deplorable apostate and argued that it was a Christian ruler's duty to destroy such material before it could poison the faithful. Ironically, he wrote a letter to another Christian leader with the chapter headings and the summary of its contents, which is one of the ways we know what Platon argued for. A copy of a summary by one of Platon's students also survived, and by cross-referencing the two independent sources, this is how we can know what he argued for. However, it's important to mention that the summary was made by Bessarion, who I had previously mentioned went on to become a Roman Catholic cardinal. In essence, both of these sources may have had a reason to portray Platon as someone who had completely rejected Christianity. For Scholarios, he hated the man in life and wanted to tarnish his reputation as a Greek thinker to an audience that was entirely Greek Orthodox. For Bessarion, it's possible that he wanted to limit the influence of his teacher's views amongst Italian humanists by associating Platon with openly pagan ideas. That said, if this was his plan, it didn't work out at all, and you're about to see why. But the story doesn't end with the burning and a couple summaries surviving, and as I mentioned, Platon's ideas achieved something of a legendary status in Italy. 14 years after Platon's death, in 1466, an Italian military commander named Sigismondo Malatesta was serving Venice in a campaign in Greece. Malatesta was the lord of Rimini, a condottiere and patron of the arts, who'd been deeply influenced by Platon's ideas and by the wider circle of Italian humanists who revered him. Malatesta did something extraordinary. He had Platon's remains exhumed from their grave in Mistra and transported them across the Adriatic to Rimini. There they were reinterred in the Tempio Malatestiano, where he continues to rest until this day. The stated reason was so that the great teacher could rest among free men, away from Ottoman-controlled territory. But the gesture was also a statement about intellectual legacy as well. In the East, Plethon's ideas had been condemned, and his life's work had been burned, while in the West, his bones were enshrined in a temple. Now there's one question that might be in your mind right now, and trust me, I had it too. To what extent did Plethon accumulate any legitimate followers to this new faith? Well, the truth is, we have absolutely no idea. But given that he imagined an entire hierarchy and church-like structure, it appears that the religion never left his inner circle. After all, had he preached this return to the old Greek gods publicly, he would have been removed from all positions of power at the very least. It's possible that he was the only person who actually followed this new faith, and that even his closest followers of his Platonic philosophies didn't buy into a return to Zeus. Plethon's project failed in the most literal sense, and as you are likely aware, the old Greek gods didn't come back during the late medieval period. The Byzantine Empire collapsed, and the Peloponnese ultimately fell to the Ottomans, with Greece not regaining any limited form of independence for nearly 400 years. In the end, in a bizarre irony, the man who wanted to bring back Zeus ended up buried in an Italian church. But the ideas he carried to Florence in 1438, the Platonic tradition he reintroduced to Western Europe, those didn't perish. His ideas became one of the foundations of the Renaissance, a tradition that would ultimately flourish while Greece was under a repressive regime. It's one of history's better ironies. The man who failed to save his own world accidentally helped build the next one, and despite this, almost no one knows his name today. On December 4th, 1977, in one of the poorest countries on earth, a man sat himself down on a 2-ton golden throne shaped like an eagle and placed a diamond-encrusted crown on his own head. His coronation robe weighed 32 pounds. It was embroidered with nearly 800,000 pearls and over 1 million crystal beads. The crown was topped with a 138-carat diamond, and the whole thing cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $25 million. Adjusted for inflation, that lands around $100 million today. That figure represented roughly 1/3 of the Central African Empire's entire annual budget, and nearly all of it was paid for by the people of France. His name was Jean-Bédel Bokassa, and if you've never heard of him, that's probably because the story is so absurd it sounds made up. Every detail of his coronation is documented, verified, and somehow still hard to believe. Bokassa's early life was bleak, even by the standards of colonial Central Africa. He was born in 1921 in Bobangi, a village in the obscure French colony of Ubangi-Shari. His father, a village chief, was beaten to death in 1927 by colonial administrators for refusing forced labor demands when Bokassa was just 6 years old. A week later, his mother, torn up by the event, decided she had enough of this world as well, leaving Bokassa an orphan. He was raised by Catholic missionaries, educated at mission schools, and eventually joined the French colonial army in 1939. What followed was a distinguished military career, and he served in Europe, Indochina, and Algeria, rose to the rank of captain, and received both the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. By any measure, he was a highly competent soldier with legitimate decorations, well respected by both the French and fellow colonial soldiers. But somewhere between the battlefields and the corridors of post-colonial African politics, Bokassa developed an obsession that would define and destroy his rule: Napoleon Bonaparte. The fixation wasn't subtle at all. He studied Napoleon's rise, his imagery, his coronation. He was completely consumed by the man and believed that he was, in essence, the African Napoleon. He reportedly kept busts and portraits of the French emperor in his home and spent lavishly on all manner of artifacts that were even loosely associated with the man. Presumably, though, he was less interested in how Napoleon's downfall came about, or perhaps he thought that he could do it all differently. When the time came to consolidate his own power, the template he reached for was European, imperial, and about 170 years out of date. On New Year's Day, 1966, Bokassa, then serving as Army Chief of Staff, overthrew President David Dacko in a largely nonviolent coup. The stated justification was Dacko's growing diplomatic ties with Communist China, indicating that he knew exactly how to justify this action to Western powers. France, which had extensive strategic interests in the region, was initially cautious about the new leader. Their concerns were allayed by November of that year, when Charles de Gaulle had made an official visit and came to believe Bokassa was an intelligent and powerful ruler. Over the following decade, Bokassa tightened his grip on the country, and as he did so, his Napoleon fantasy would slowly become closer to reality. He abolished the Constitution, dissolved the National Assembly, and declared himself president for life. Then, on December 4th, 1976, exactly 1 year before the coronation, he went further. He dissolved the Central African Republic unilaterally and proclaimed the Central African Empire, with himself as Emperor Bokassa I. The move had no popular demand and no practical rationale. It existed because Bokassa wanted it to exist, and of course, because Napoleon did it. France went along with it, and by the mid-1970s, President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had developed a personal relationship with Bokassa that went well beyond diplomacy. The two men were hunting companions, reportedly spending time together on annual trips in eastern Central Africa. The French president, both publicly and privately, referred to Bokassa as a friend, and perhaps more surprisingly, as a family member. The relationship would later become one of the more damaging political scandals in modern French history, but in 1977, the friendship was still a functioning arrangement. The coronation itself was modeled on Napoleon's 1804 ceremony down to specific details. The Golden Eagle throne was crafted by 30 French artisans in Normandy at a cost of $2.5 million. The crown was made by a prestigious Parisian jeweler, and Bokassa's robe was designed by a 200-year-old business that had an association with Napoleon. 8 white horses were imported from Belgium to pull a restored 19th century carriage through the streets of Bangui, the capital. Unfortunately, 2 of the horses died before the event due to climate issues, so Bokassa and his wife Catherine finished the procession in a limousine instead. That symbolism should have been a warning for what would come next, but it wasn't. The ceremony took place at a stadium in Bangui that was named after Emperor Bokassa himself. It was staggeringly hot, over 35 degrees Celsius, with roughly 90% humidity. Foreign dignitaries in formal wear reportedly suffered badly, but the bigger problem for Bokassa wasn't the heat. Nearly every monarch and significant world leader invited had declined to attend the event. Emperor Hirohito of Japan, the Shah of Iran, Pope Paul VI, all sent their regrets that they wouldn't be able to make it. Some believed that the plan had been to have the Pope crown Emperor Bokassa, or at least to have Bokassa take the crown from the Pope and then crown himself and his Empress. The reason this speculation is so significant is because this was exactly what Napoleon himself did more than a century and a half prior. Even Bokassa's fellow African strongmen found excuses to stay home. Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, Omar Bongo of Gabon, Idi Amin of Uganda, none of them showed. The highest-ranking foreign royal present was reportedly the Prince of Liechtenstein, a fact that Bokassa reportedly considered somewhat humiliating to His Imperial Majesty. France sent Robert Galley, its Minister of Cooperation, rather than any senior figure, again to the disappointment of the new African emperor. The streets of Bangui were lined with onlookers who, by contemporary accounts, showed little obvious enthusiasm. The international press was merciless, and coverage focused on the contrast between the ceremony's opulence and the country's poverty. Bokassa's coronation couldn't have happened without French money and French complicity. France funded the ceremony primarily through development assistance, effectively channeling an entire year's worth of foreign aid to the Central African Republic into a single day. France even loaned 17 aircraft and assigned personnel to support the orchestra. The strategic logic centered on maintaining French influence in a region it considered part of its sphere of control. Bokassa was both increasingly erratic and increasingly brutal, but he was cooperative on matters France cared about. The coronation was the price of keeping him in the fold, and whether anyone in Paris genuinely believed this was sustainable is another question entirely. The coronation was the high water mark of Bokassa's reign, and everything after it moved in one direction. In January 1979, Bokassa ordered all students, from elementary school through university, to purchase and wear uniforms manufactured by a company owned by one of his wives. When students protested, the regime responded with mass arrests of the students, including ones who were in elementary school. On April 19, 1979, approximately 100 students were beaten to death by guards while imprisoned. Subsequent investigations alleged that Bokassa personally participated in the violence, though he denied it for the rest of his life. In fact, he denied ordering it at all, simply stating that it was an action taken by people who were acting outside the law. The massacre prompted international condemnation and the withdrawal of foreign aid. France, now politically exposed by its long relationship with Bokassa, moved to cut ties. On September 20th, 1979, while Bokassa was in Libya meeting with Muammar Gaddafi, French special forces executed Operation Barracuda. French paratroopers landed in Bangui with helicopters and transport aircraft. There was no significant resistance, and it was over within hours. David Dacko, the same man Bokassa had overthrown 13 years earlier, was restored to power. Unsurprisingly, the Central African Empire ceased to exist, and the Central African Republic was restored. Barely a month later, a French newspaper revealed that Bokassa had given diamonds to Giscard d'Estaing, reportedly worth around 1 million francs. Giscard issued a denial, describing the gifts as small stones given between friends. Bokassa, for his part, contradicted him, claiming he'd given diamonds of 10 to 20 carats on multiple occasions, and that Giscard's extended family had received even more. The scandal dogged the French president through the 1981 presidential election, which he lost to François Mitterrand. Bokassa spent 4 years in exile in the Ivory Coast, and then moved to France, but, as it turned out, he longed for his homeland. In 1986, he voluntarily returned to the Central African Republic, where he was immediately arrested and charged with a variety of serious offenses. In the end, he was only convicted of treason, though he was later pardoned in 1993 before passing away, almost completely forgotten on November 3, 1996. The coronation remains the thing people remember, if they remember Emperor Bokassa at all. If you're standing at Ashington in southeast Essex right now, you're looking at gently rolling farmland, a quiet parish church, and not much else. And yet, most historians believe this is where, on October 18th, 1016, one of the most consequential battles in English history took place. This was a battle that ended Anglo-Saxon resistance to Danish conquest and handed England to a foreign king. The Battle of Ascendon doesn't get the attention of Hastings, which happened almost exactly 50 years later. But in many ways, it was the more decisive engagement, given how it would permanently weaken the kingdom. Ascendon broke the back of an English kingdom that had been fighting for its survival, wiped out a generation of military leadership, and forced a political settlement that would reshape England. England in the early 11th century was a very wealthy kingdom in a deep crisis. King Ethelred, who history remembers as the Unready, had been struggling against Danish raids and invasions for most of his reign. By 1013, those raids had escalated into full-scale conquest, led by Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. He devastated southern and midland England systematically, and by Christmas Day, 1013, the English nobility had given up on Ethelred entirely and acknowledged Sweyn as their king. Sweyn's triumph was short-lived. He died on the 3rd of February 1014, having ruled England for barely 5 weeks. The cause of his death is uncertain, but the political consequences were immediate. His death created a power vacuum, and Ethelred returned from exile with military force, briefly reasserting control and driving Sweyn's son Canute out of the country. Ethelred's forces marched to Lindsey and destroyed much of Canute's remaining support base. But Ethelred himself was a spent force, and when he passed away in April 1016, the fight passed to his son Edmund, who would earn the nickname Ironside for good reason. Edmund was everything his father wasn't. He was energetic, aggressive, and willing to lead from the front. When Canute returned to England in September 1015 with a formidable invasion force, Edmund heroically rallied the resistance. The year that followed was one of the most intense periods of sustained military campaigning England had ever seen. Edmund and Canute fought at least 5 major engagements before Ascendon, with Edmund winning some and losing others, neither side able to land a knockout blow. Edmund lifted the siege of London, fought Canute to a standstill at Brentford, and chased the Danish army across half of southern England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the grinding nature of this campaign in exhausting detail. Armies marched and countermarched across southern England, ravaging the countryside as they went. Canute's forces raided through Dorset, Wiltshire, and Somerset, all while Edmund pursued, engaged, withdrew, and regrouped. It was attritional warfare at a scale England hadn't experienced since the days of Alfred the Great, 2 centuries earlier. By October 1016, both sides were battered, and Edmund had gathered what forces he could and pursued Canute's army into Essex. The two forces converged near a place the chroniclers called Ascendon, a place that was apparently so renowned in its time that no one actually bothered to say where it was. The precise mechanics of what happened on October 18, 1016, are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Between the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, John of Worcester's Chronicle, and Henry of Huntingdon's Historia Anglorum, we can piece together the broad strokes. The English army reportedly formed up on higher ground, arranged in a battle line 4 ranks deep. Edmund, according to Henry of Huntingdon, abandoned his position between the royal standards and charged into the Danish front ranks himself. It was a display of personal courage that bordered on recklessness, and it speaks to the desperate nature of the fight. And then Edric Strona, one of the most powerful and duplicitous figures in all of English history, made his move. He'd actually switched sides between Edmund and Canute multiple times already. At Ascendon, he was nominally fighting for Edmund since the young king couldn't afford not to take on such a powerful apparent ally, despite previous betrayals. But at the critical moment, Edric withdrew his forces from the battle, taking his large contingent of well-trained warriors with him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is blunt about it. Edric started the flight, and in doing so betrayed his king and all the people of England. Whether Edric had struck a deal with Canute beforehand, or simply read the battlefield and decided to back the winning side, historians have debated for 1,000 years. What isn't debated is the effect. Edric's withdrawal tore a hole in the English line and turned an evenly matched battle into a rout. Henry of Huntingdon later wrote that there was never greater treachery in England than what happened at Assendon. Notably, the casualty list would, in essence, become a roll call of the entire upper echelon of the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. With his army shattered and his support base decimated, Edmund had little choice but to negotiate. He and Canute met on a small island called Alney, near Deerhurst in Gloucestershire, on the River Severn. The terms they agreed upon sounded reasonable enough on paper, but they carried a hidden threat, since each agreed to make the other man the successor to the territories. Edmund would keep Wessex and London, and Canute would take everything north of the Thames, including all the old Danelaw territories. Edmund, for his part, died just 6 weeks after the treaty of quote-unquote unknown causes, having reigned for only 222 days. Canute inherited the entire kingdom, and he was crowned king of all England before the year was out. In 1020, Canute returned to the site of the battle and dedicated a church in memory of all those who'd fallen there, regardless of what side they'd been on. Some scholars have identified this as the Church of St. Andrew at Ashington, but the truth is, no one knows for certain. The Ashington location has a serious archaeological problem for a battle of this supposed size and scope. There's simply absolutely no remnants to indicate a battle ever took place there. The location question itself tells you something about how poorly this battle has been remembered. Despite being one of the most fateful battles in English history, a battle that changed the course of the history of the world, we only have an educated guess as to where it took place. Most modern scholars lean towards Ashington, but the debate continues, and unless new archaeological evidence comes to light, it probably always will. In December of 1934, deep beneath the Arsenal Tower of the Moscow Kremlin, a Russian archaeologist by the name of Ignatius Stiletsky crawled through a tunnel. At the end, according to the accounts he later left behind, he came face to face with a massive iron door fitted with bolts and a small viewing window, but he didn't get to open it. Soviet officials halted the dig, sealed the entrance, and offered no public explanation. A few weeks earlier, the prominent Bolshevik Sergei Kirov had been cut down in Leningrad. The regime suddenly had bigger concerns than letting an obsessive academic poke around the foundations of the seat of Soviet power. Stiletsky would never get to go back, and he died in 1949 with the door still closed and whatever was behind it still unseen. The thing he believed was on the other side of that door was a collection of books, and not just any books. These were Greco-Roman codices smuggled out of Constantinople before the Ottoman cannons brought down the walls. Latin and Greek manuscripts thought lost for millennia. This hoard had a name in Russian sources, the Libreia, from the Latin liber, meaning book, but in English we tend to call it the Lost Library of Ivan the Terrible. To understand why anyone would believe such a thing existed in the first place, we have to back up to a wedding in Rome in June of 1472. The bride was Sophia Palaiologina, niece of Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor of Constantinople. She'd been raised under papal protection after her family fled the Ottoman conquest of 1453, and she was being married off to Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow. This was a deal brokered by Pope Paul II that the Vatican hoped would bring the Russian Church back into the Catholic fold. That part of the plan went nowhere, but Sophia made the trip anyway, sailing from the Hanseatic port of Lübeck across the Baltic, before ultimately arriving in Moscow that November. According to the legend that grew up around her, she didn't arrive empty-handed, Buried somewhere in her dowry caravan were chests of books, salvaged manuscripts that her uncle Thomas Palaiologos had supposedly hauled out of the doomed ancient capital. Some accounts put the count at around 800 volumes of books. Other versions go further and trace the collection's origins back through the Imperial Library of Constantinople to the wreckage of the Library of Alexandria itself. The most extreme versions of the legend even go so far as to claim that the collection contained ancient Egyptian writings and texts from as far away as China. This is the part where you need to apply a little historical skepticism because there's almost no contemporary documentary evidence that Sophia brought any books at all. The Russian chronicles that record her marriage and her 31 years as Grand Princess are remarkably quiet about her supposed literary cargo. Modern scholars who've gone looking for the trail have come up completely empty. A systematic study of Greek manuscripts known to have existed in Moscow, conducted in the 1960s, found nothing that could be traced back to a collection arriving with Sophia. The academic who spearheaded this study determined that the most plausible reading of the surviving sources is that the imperial collection stayed with the Ottomans. The romantic version of Sophia's wedding caravan, according to this historian, was mostly a thing later writers built around her after the fact. And I tend to believe this for another reason that this historian didn't specifically raise. Princess Sophia was raised under the protection of the papacy. Had the Pope gotten word that Sophia was potentially hauling around the most valuable collection of books in the world, I find it unlikely she would have been allowed to keep them. However, even on the off chance they weren't confiscated, it's even more unlikely that the church scholars wouldn't have taken a crack at these texts during her decades in Italy. The library makes its first real entrance into the historical record in 1518, almost half a century after Sophia's arrival, in the form of a Greek monk from Mount Athos. His name was Michael Trivolis, though history remembers him as Maximus the Greek, which I must say is a ridiculously good name for an Orthodox monk. Sophia's son, Grand Prince Vasily III, had written to the monks at Mount Athos, requesting a translator who could render certain Greek religious texts into Church Slavonic. One of the monasteries sent Maximus, who arrived in Moscow that year, and was reportedly granted an audience with the prince that included a tour of the royal book collection. According to the account that survives, Maximus was floored, and he told Vasily that even in Greece itself, he'd never seen so many Greek volumes assembled in one place. That single line is the seed from which the entire legend grows. Without it, there's almost nothing to suggest the library ever existed. With it, you suddenly have a highly credible Greek scholar attesting to a Russian royal collection of unusual scale and quality. But here's the problem with leaning too hard on Maximus's testimony, and that's the fact that we don't actually have it from the Greek monk directly. The story comes to us through a biography written by Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a Muscovite nobleman who knew Maximus, and even that text is contested. In the 19th century, Russian historians came to question whether the text was authentic at all, or whether it was simply a way to puff up the grandeur of Moscow. In essence, the argument is that when Maximus arrived, Moscow was an intellectual backwater on the edges of Europe. By having a great Greek scholar claim to be floored by the library kept by the Muscovites, this was essentially a retcon to make the Russians look more important than they were at the time. This is a common practice throughout history, especially when a state has a rapidly ascendant arc like Moscow would ultimately have. In one of my previous videos, I've discussed how great Roman writers basically wrote historical fiction about why Alexander the Great didn't bother to try to conquer them. This claim that Maximus was stunned by the volumes kept by this then backwards principality is a similar sort of impulse. Russians in the 18th century had long lost sight of the fact that in 1472, when Princess Sophia came to them, They weren't the great continent-spanning empire they were by then. The Muscovite Russians at the time were still technically subjects of the remainder of the Golden Horde, and most certainly not on the forefront of scholarship yet. The next major appearance of the library comes from Livonia, the territory we'd today call Latvia and Estonia. A Baltic German writer named Franz Neustadt, working at the start of the 17th century, included in his chronicle the story of a Lutheran pastor named Johannes Federmann. Federmann had been brought to Moscow in the 1560s or 1570s and was reportedly summoned by Ivan the Terrible himself. The Tsar showed him into a locked storeroom somewhere in the Kremlin and asked him to survey what was inside. What the German found, according to the chronicle, was an enormous collection of ancient books, many of which he recognized only by reputation, because the originals had been thought lost. It's a great story, but it also has serious credibility issues, since Federmann himself never wrote any of this down. The chronicle was compiled roughly 30 years after the supposed event by a man who wasn't there, and no one ever produced a single title from the collection allegedly catalogued. Adding to this, the chronicler claimed that Federmann may have been eliminated by Ivan the Terrible to protect the secret of the collection. While this is technically possible, to me this reads a lot like myth-making surrounding the lost library. The next big piece of supposed evidence surfaced in 1819, when a Baltic German legal historian named Christian von Dabilov made a big claim. Working in the archives of Parnu in what's now Estonia, Dabilov claimed to have found a document titled Manuscripts Held by the Tsar. According to Dabilov, the list was extraordinary, and it listed numerous lost works of Livy, Cicero, and Virgil that were allegedly held by Ivan the Terrible. It was the kind of inventory that would, if real, rewrite huge chunks of classical scholarship overnight. Dabilov copied down portions of the document, then left Parnu to share his find with a colleague at the University of Dorpat. When he returned, the document was allegedly gone, and try as he might, he could never locate it again. That said, a vanished list of impossibly perfect contents discovered by a single scholar who can't produce his evidence is, generally speaking, not how real archival finds work. That said, it's technically possible, which I believe I've said a few times throughout this segment now. None of this historical uncertainty ever stopped the searches, though, and even Peter the Great ordered an investigation into the lost library, but found nothing. Napoleon reportedly believed that the lost library was real, and when he marched into the city in September 1812, he may have also ordered a search for the collection. If anything was found during this period, there's no record of it, and it remains a possibility that Napoleon's name was just attached to a growing legend. In the 1890s, a German scholar spent months in Moscow chasing the legend after he became convinced that a Homeric manuscript had been brought there by Sophia Palaiologina. He concluded that it was almost certainly in a library that was somewhere beneath the Kremlin, but he wasn't able to get approval for an expedition in the seat of Russian power. It turns out that the idea of blasting apart a portion of the Moscow Kremlin wasn't the most appealing idea to the Russians at the time. And then there was Stiletsky, the man who I mentioned at the start of this segment, and he was a different kind of obsessive entirely. Born in 1878 in what's now Ukraine, he stumbled across what he believed was Dabilov's catalog while working in the Parnu archives in 1914. Now let's just say the next few years were a bit rough around the edges for Russia as a whole, so despite his belief, nothing happened for a decade and a half. In 1929, the Soviet government finally gave him permission to dig under the Kremlin, but there were substantial delays. Excavations began on December 1st, 1933, beneath the Arsenal Tower. But then just over a year later, after Kirov was eliminated and Stalin's purges began swallowing up everything in Soviet life, the dig was shut down. Stiletsky lived through the Axis siege of Moscow, And if you expected that this made him more focused on basic survival, you'd be wrong. He thought that finding these documents during the siege may be a morale boost of sorts, and petitioned to resume his digging. Unsurprisingly, the Soviets, facing civilizational annihilation, had slightly bigger issues to handle at the time. So that leaves us with what's down there and what isn't. And the honest answer to all of this is that we don't know for sure. There was almost certainly a large collection of books in the Kremlin during the periods in question, so the idea of a lost royal book archive isn't completely fanciful. However, the idea of a sealed underground vault containing the lost works of antiquity brought by a Greek princess and untouched since the 16th century is something else entirely. The most likely explanation for the library's disappearance, if anything ever disappeared, is the most boring one. Moscow was a wooden city that burned spectacularly and often, sometimes wiping out entire neighborhoods within a single afternoon. The Great Fires of 1547, 1571, and 1626 each leveled enormous portions of the city and consumed countless manuscripts in the process. The time of troubles brought Polish occupation, sustained looting, and the dispersal of court possessions across the rest of Europe. But, that said, if Stiletsky is to be believed, that iron door is still down there, somewhere beneath the Arsenal Tower, waiting for someone to open it. When most people picture the Roman Empire, they see togas, marble forums, and senators sparring in Latin. But it's easy to forget that Rome didn't actually fall in 476, and the eastern half of the empire kept going for nearly another 1,000 years out of Constantinople. But somewhere during that long echo, something quiet and strange happened. The language of Scipio Africanus, of Cicero, of Virgil, and of Julius Caesar slowly drifted out of the mouths of the men who sat on the Roman throne. The emperors still called themselves Romans, and they still issued laws in Latin, at least for a while. They still styled themselves as the heirs of Augustus and would never stop doing so. But sometime during this period, the tongue they actually grew up speaking had completely changed. And the man who stood at the final edge of that change, the last Roman emperor who grew up genuinely speaking Latin as his first language, is someone you've almost certainly heard of. His name was Justinian, and his story was truly unusual even by the standards of one of the greatest Roman emperors in history. Justinian wasn't born into the purple by any means, quite the opposite. He came into the world around 482 in a small village called Tauresium, in the Balkan region of Dardania in what's now North Macedonia. His family were peasant farmers with no real claim to nobility, and his birth name wasn't even Justinian. It was Petrus Sabatius, a thoroughly Latin name for a person in a region where Latin had settled in centuries earlier as the common tongue of colonists, soldiers, and administrators. That geography matters more than it sounds. The Balkans in the late 5th century sat on a linguistic fault line. South and east of it, Greek dominated the cities, the churches, and the markets. North and west, especially in old provinces like Illyricum, Dalmatia, and Dardania, Latin had sunk deep roots in the rural population. Peasant families there weren't speaking the polished Latin of Roman senators. Theirs was a tough, rustic Latin. It was the kind soldiers picked up in garrison towns and passed down to their children around the hearth. That's the language the future Justinian grew up hearing in his mother's kitchen, and it's the one he'd carry with him into the imperial court. None of this would matter to history if not for the boy's uncle, a rough-edged career soldier named Justin. Justin had walked down from the same Dardanian hills to Constantinople as a young man, enlisted in the Imperial Guard, and slowly clawed his way up through the ranks. By the time he was old, he commanded the Excubitors, the elite palace guard, one of the most powerful military posts in the empire. He could barely read or write by most accounts, but he understood politics in a deep way. Justin brought his nephew down to the capital, paid for an education in rhetoric, theology, and law, and had him formally adopted as his heir. Petrus Sabatius was given the new name Justinian, a deliberate echo of his uncle and patron. When the old emperor Anastasius died in 518 without naming a successor, the guards maneuvered Justin onto the throne. For the next 9 years, the elderly Justin ruled in name, while the now polished and lawyerly Justinian worked behind the curtain. When Justin passed away in 527, the nephew, the boy who had once been a peasant farmer, slid his way onto the throne. Both men, uncle and nephew, sat on the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire while being native speakers of Latin in a city that had become overwhelmingly Greek. Constantinople, by the 6th century, was a Greek-speaking metropolis. The church preached in Greek. The markets haggled in Greek. Everything was in Greek. Across Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, most of Justinian's subjects spoke Greek, Coptic, Aramaic, or something else entirely. Latin was the language of the government, the army's paperwork, and the law, but it was no longer the language of the streets he governed. Contemporary observers picked up on the tension between Justinian and his people, especially in the highest halls of power. The historian Procopius, who served as a legal advisor on Justinian's military campaigns, eventually turned around and wrote a venomous secret history of the regime. He recorded an emperor whose provincial Balkan origins were obvious at court, and that this was something of an embarrassment. If Procopius is to be believed, the Greeks at the court essentially saw Justinian and his family as a 6th century version of the Beverly Hillbillies. Modern scholars reading this account argue that while Justinian was fluent in Greek, he likely didn't speak it at a refined native level. Further, for complex diplomatic and legal matters, he preferred his own mother tongue of Latin over the ascendant Greek language. Justinian's most famous project shows this vividly. Between 529 and 534, he commissioned a massive overhaul of Roman law. He pulled together centuries of legal opinions, imperial edicts, and legal textbooks into one coherent body. The result, the Corpus Juris Civilis, would become the bedrock of European legal thought for the next 1500 years. And he had it compiled in Latin, because in his mind, and in the minds of his lawyers, the law of Rome was naturally and obviously a Latin thing. To compose it in Greek may have felt like cutting the empire loose from its own foundations, which Justinian believed himself to represent. Reality crept in anyway, and later in his reign, Justinian issued a flood of new laws, the Novellae, and more of these appeared in Greek rather than Latin. He was pragmatic, and if the courts and the provinces needed Greek to apply the law day to day, Greek they would get. Even the emperor who spoke Latin at home couldn't hold back the tide forever, and after all, Greek had arguably always been the true prestige language of the Romans anyway. The other part of Justinian's legacy worth thinking about in this context is his obsession with the West. He poured enormous resources and burned through a generation of soldiers trying to take back the lost western provinces. His generals Belisarius and Narses clawed North Africa away from the Vandal kingdom and Italy away from the Ostrogoths. For a flickering moment, Rome itself once again answered to a Roman emperor, a Latin-speaking one, ruling from the east. It's tempting to read his Western campaigns as the project of a man who felt the Latin world slipping away beneath his feet and wanted desperately to hold it together. Whether or not that's psychologically accurate, the effect was the same. Justinian tried to stitch the Latin half of the Mediterranean back onto the Greek-speaking empire. The reconquest proved fragile, and much of Italy fell to the Lombards within a few years of his death. The North African recovery held longer but collapsed under the Arab conquests of the 7th century. After Justinian died in 565, the thread of Latin frayed increasingly quickly. His successor, his nephew Justin II, was raised in Constantinople and is generally described by modern historians as a Greek speaker first, with Latin as a second language. Notably, some have argued that Justin II may have actually been the last native Latin-speaking emperor, though if he was, he spoke Greek and Latin with equal fluency. The emperors who followed, like Tiberius II and Maurice, leaned further into Greek, although Latin clung on in the army, the court, and legal ceremony for decades yet. The decisive shift came under Heraclius, who took the throne in 610. During his reign, Greek displaced Latin as the working language of imperial administration in practice, not by any clean decree, and the change stuck. The imperial title itself shifted at this time, with the old Latin imperator giving way to the Greek basileus. From that point on, every Roman emperor, all the way to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, was a Greek speaker by birth and upbringing. Justinian almost certainly didn't know he was the last of his linguistic kind, and he acted like a man standing squarely inside his tradition. He fully believed himself part of an unbroken lineage reaching all the way back to Augustus, and he spent a reign of nearly 40 years acting on that assumption. But Justinian was already an anachronism, and the city around him had been Greek through and through for generations. In the East, Latin had slowly become the first language of rustic provincial types, and anyone who wanted to be anyone had long realized Greek was the language that opened doors. The church was in the middle of defining itself in Greek, and every year the population of the empire became more and more Hellenized. And one day, of course, there would be Roman emperors who not only spoke Greek as their first language, but emperors who didn't understand Latin at all. But that historical question is a story for another segment in another future video.